The fortress at Tamm Passage held for 6 years, and for 4 of them, the enemy was not trying to take it. That is the thing about the Tamm siege that nobody understood at the time and that everybody understands now, and the gap between those two states cost 11,000 lives. The Sorrel Compact was not besieging Tamm. It was maintaining Tamm, feeding it just enough pressure to keep 60,000 defenders and 40 warships committed to a rock that had stopped mattering strategically in the 2nd year. Tamm Passage was a choke point on a route that the Compact had, by then, stopped needing. They had opened a 2nd corridor through the weft in year 2. The fortress guarded a door into an empty room. Nobody inside knew. That was not a failure of intelligence in the ordinary sense. Tamm's sensors worked, its analysts were competent, and its situation reports were accurate. What it did not have, and could not have had, was a view of the whole board, and the Compact went to considerable expense to ensure that every piece of information reaching Tamm was consistent with a fortress that was still the linchpin of a sector. They ran convincing attacks. They lost ships doing it, 9 over 4 years deliberately on a schedule. They intercepted couriers they could have let through, and let through couriers they could have intercepted. There is a Compact staff document, recovered afterwards, that budgets for this under a heading translating as Maintenance of Significance. The commander of Tamm Passage for the last 4 of those 6 years was a woman named Ottiline Ferrant, and she worked it out 14 months before the relief came, and what she did about it is the reason anybody still argues about Tamm. She worked it out from the shipping. Not from an intercept, not from an analyst, not from any of the intelligence apparatus a fortress of that size carries. She worked it out because she had spent 19 years as a supply officer before she ever commanded anything, and because in the 4th year she started reading the salvage manifests. Tamm collected wreckage. Any besieged fortress does. It is free metal, and it comes to you. The salvage crews stripped every Compact hull that died within reach, and they logged what they recovered, and those logs went into an inventory system that Ferrant had personally set up 11 years earlier at a different posting and knew intimately. What she noticed was hull age. The Compact ships dying at Tamm were old, not obsolete, functional, armed, crewed, and dangerous, but consistently, across 4 years, drawn from the oldest 2 brackets in the Compact's order of battle. A fleet fighting for a decisive objective does not do that. A fleet fighting for a decisive objective sends what it has. She pulled the figures herself over 9 nights and did not tell her staff what she was doing, and what she found was worse than old hulls. The pattern was too clean. In 4 years of fighting, not one Compact ship lost at Tamm had been newer than 14 years old. Not one. The distribution was not a distribution, it was a policy. The Compact was spending its scrap on Tamm and keeping everything else somewhere that mattered more. Ferrant sat with that for 3 days. Then she did the arithmetic she had been avoiding, which was to add up what Tamm was costing her own side. 60,000 personnel, 40 hulls, and a resupply commitment that ran a convoy through contested space every 40 days at an average loss of 1 ship in 6. Tamm was not holding a door. Tamm was a hostage, and her own command had been paying the ransom for 4 years without noticing. The obvious move was to report it, and she did immediately in a courier packet that took 19 days to reach Sector Command and produced a reply that took another 22. The reply is a genuinely reasonable document, and it is worth reading before condemning anybody. It thanked her for the analysis. It noted that the hull age observation was interesting. It pointed out, correctly, that a fortress commander 4 years into a siege is subject to well-documented cognitive pressures, that the salvage manifest inference rested on a sample of 9 ships, and that Sector Command's own assessment, informed by sources Ferrant did not have access to, continued to rate Tamm Passage as strategically critical. It instructed her to hold. The second packet she sent was longer and included the raw manifests. The reply to that one took 31 days and was shorter and less warm, and it instructed her to hold. There is a version of Ferrant that is a hero of insubordination, and it is a popular version, and it is wrong. She did not defy the order. She held Tamm Passage for another 11 months, exactly as instructed. And during those 11 months, she did the only thing available to a commander who believes her own side is wrong and cannot prove it. She made the fortress cheaper. Not weaker, cheaper. It is a distinction that took her staff months to accept, and that is now taught as a discipline in its own right, and the whole of it fits in one sentence that she said to her officers in the 5th year, and that is carved badly into a wall at the staff college. If we cannot stop paying for this rock, we can at least stop paying so much. What she did was strip a fortress while under siege without letting the enemy see it happen, and it took 11 months, and it is a masterpiece of a very unglamorous kind. She started with the convoys, because the convoys were the bleeding wound. Every 40 days a resupply ran the gauntlet and lost, on average, a ship in 6. Ferrand's first act was to extend the interval to 60 days, which is trivially easy to order and nearly impossible to survive, because a fortress at 60-day resupply has to find 20 days of consumption somewhere. She found it in a dozen places, and none of them were dramatic. Ration density. Water reclamation ratios pushed from 91% to 96%, which took 7 months of engineering and cost a great deal of miserable labor. The closure of 9 of the fortress's 14 pressurized volumes, consolidating 60,000 people into a footprint designed for 35 and generating a quantity of interpersonal friction that her provost's office documented in exhaustive and depressing detail. She cut the garrison. This is the part that people find hardest because it looks like weakening the fortress, and it was. Over 11 months, on every returning convoy, Tamm Passage sent out personnel, not as an evacuation, as routine rotation, at exactly the rate the Compact would expect to see, with replacements arriving in the same numbers on paper and considerably fewer in fact. She emptied a fortress of 19,000 people while its garrison strength, as visible to any observer counting hulls and traffic, did not move at all. The mechanism was almost insultingly simple, and it worked because it was boring. Every convoy that came in carried replacement personnel, and the manifest said so, and the manifest was accurate. The replacements existed, and they were aboard. What the Compact could observe was hull traffic and dock activity, and both were exactly what a fortress at establishment produces. What the Compact could not observe was that the same 160 people had been riding in and riding out again for 11 months. They were logged in on arrival, assigned, and quietly re-embarked on the outbound leg along with the genuine rotation. Ferrand called them the ballast, which her provost marshal objected to on the grounds that it was contemptuous of the people involved, and she agreed and went on using it because no better word presented itself. The remaining risk was chatter. A fortress emptying by a 5th generates enormous quantities of it, and Tamm's own transmissions were being monitored continuously. So the traffic volume was held constant by the least glamorous method available. A signals officer generated routine administrative messages to fill the gap, and the content of those messages was real fortress business, backdated, resent, and reformatted, because inventing traffic is detectable and recycling it is not. 19,000 people left Tamm Passage in 11 months, and the Compact's daily signal count varied by less than 4% across the entire period. The Compact's observation of Tamm during this period is a matter of record now, and it is the most satisfying document in the whole affair. Their assessment in the 6th year rated the fortress as fully invested, morale nominal, garrison consistent with establishment. The deception had one requirement that Ferrand could not delegate and did not enjoy, which was that the fighting had to stay convincing. A fortress that is quietly hollowing itself out has every incentive to be careful. Careful is exactly what a besieging force notices. So, Tamm Passage went on fighting at the tempo it had fought at for 4 years, with a 5th of the people, and the arithmetic of that fell on the crews who stayed. Her gunnery officers worked doubled watches for 11 months. Damage control ran at establishment on paper and at 40% in reality, which meant that a hit that would have been contained in the third year took 3 hours in the sixth. Her casualty figures during the strip-down are higher per engagement than at any earlier point in the siege, and she knew they would be before she started, and she wrote the projection down in advance and filed it, which is the single thing about Ottoline Ferrand that her critics have never been able to get past. She estimated 400 additional dead. The actual figure was 461. Her own account of that number is one paragraph in a document otherwise entirely concerned with logistics, and it is not an apology. I have been asked whether the 461 were worth it. The question assumes the alternative was that they lived. The alternative was that Tamm continued at full establishment for another 2 years at the rates we had been sustaining, which by the same projection is 900, and that 60,000 people remained committed to a position I had by then satisfied myself was worthless. I did not trade lives for nothing. I traded a larger number of them for a smaller one, in the dark, without permission, on my own assessment, and I have never been able to prove the counterfactual and never will be. The relief came in the 6th year, and it came because the Compact finally overreached, which had nothing to do with Ferrand, and which she always insisted on saying first. The second corridor through the weft was discovered by an unrelated reconnaissance sweep. Once Sector Command understood that the Compact had an alternative route, the whole picture reorganized itself in about 9 days, and Tamm Passage went from strategically critical to a trap that had been holding 40 hulls for 4 years. And the recriminations began before the relief force had even sailed. What the relief force found when it broke through was not what anybody had prepared for. They had expected a fortress at the end of its endurance, starving, overcrowded, medically catastrophic. 6 years of siege on the standard model produces a specific and well-documented condition, and there were 3 hospital ships in the relief formation for exactly that reason. They found 41,000 people at 88% of establishment body mass, a functioning medical system, 9 of 14 volumes cold and sealed, and a fortress with 4 months of consumables in hand and a resupply interval that had not been under 60 days for nearly a year. They also found that they had come to relieve a garrison that was, in every practical sense, already most of the way out. The Relief Force Commander's signal is 4 words long, and it went to Sector Command, unencrypted, which was a breach of protocol that nobody ever pursued. Tamm is not besieged. It was the correct signal, and it was also, for the 461, about 14 months late. The Relief Commander understood that before he sent it. He had come up through the same service as Ferrand, and he knew exactly what he was looking at when he counted 9 sealed volumes and found a fortress that had been quietly getting out of its own way for the better part of a year. And his private log for that day contains a single line that he never submitted anywhere. She did our job for us, and she is going to be tried for it. The inquiry took 2 years, and it was not, whatever the popular account says, a witch hunt. It was a serious institution asking a serious question, and the question was this: had Ottoline Ferrand conducted an unauthorized partial evacuation of a fortress she had been explicitly ordered to hold at establishment? The answer was yes. She said so on the first day in those words and declined to characterize it any other way, and spent the following 2 years refusing every opportunity her counsel constructed to soften it. The inquiry's difficulty was not the facts. It was that everything she had done had worked, that her assessment of the Compact's intent had been confirmed in full, and that the 461 dead were fewer than any credible alternative, and that none of those things were a defense to the charge, because the charge was about authority and not outcome. Her closing statement is 9 sentences, and it is the reason the case is still taught. I want to be clear that I am not asking to be excused. If an officer may set aside a direct order because she has privately concluded her superiors are wrong, then there is no chain of command, and I have spent 30 years inside one, and I know exactly what it is worth. I broke it. I did so knowing what I was breaking. What I would ask the inquiry to record is the position I was in, because somebody else will be in it. I had an assessment I could not prove, an order I believed was killing people for nothing, and a communications interval of 51 days. I could obey and be wrong, or disobey and be wrong, and there was no third thing. The system gave me no way to be right. I would like that examined by people who are not me, in a room that is not under fire, with more than 51 days. The inquiry found against her. It had no other option, and it said so. She was relieved of command, reduced 1 grade, and retired 11 months later at her own request. She never held a posting again, and she never asked for one, and she declined, twice, to have the finding reviewed when political conditions would have made a reversal straightforward. The reason she gave the second time was characteristically unhelpful to her supporters. The finding is correct. I would like it left alone. If you overturn it, you are establishing that a commander who turns out to be right was permitted, and that is a far more dangerous rule than the one you have now, because every commander believes she is going to turn out to be right. What did change, and what she spent the last 19 years of her life working on, was the 51 days. The Ferrant reforms are dull. They are a set of procedures governing the standing of a subordinate commander's dissenting assessment, a requirement that a contested strategic evaluation be logged, escalated on a defined clock, and, critically, reviewed by a body other than the one that issued the original order. They created a mechanism by which a commander who believes her superiors are wrong can be told so, formally, quickly, by somebody with the standing to make it final. It is bureaucracy. It is entirely bureaucracy, and she knew it, and she was fond of pointing out that the reforms would not have saved a single one of the 461 because the Compact's deception would still have taken 4 years to unravel. That is not what they are for, she said. They are for the next one, who will not be me and who will be wrong. The fortress at Tamm Passage was decommissioned 9 years after the relief, and it was not preserved, which was Ferrant's explicit recommendation and the one piece of advice the service took from her without argument. It had no strategic value. It never had after the 2nd year. Maintaining it as a monument would have cost a permanent garrison and a supply line, and she pointed out, in a memorandum that is 2 paragraphs long and is quoted more often than her closing statement, that a fortress preserved as a monument is a fortress that somebody eventually decides to use. The whole lesson of Tamm is that a position outlives its purpose and nobody notices. Do not commemorate that by keeping the position. What survives instead is the salvage log. It is a bound inventory of scrap metal recovered from 9 destroyed compact hulls over 4 years, listing mass, alloy, condition, and hull age in the hand of a succession of junior supply clerks who had no idea they were compiling anything of interest. It is monumentally boring. It is on display at the Staff College in a case, open at the page where the 14-year hull age ceiling first becomes visible if you are looking for it, which nobody was for 4 years. There is a card beside it, and the card does not mention Ferrant at all. It gives the dates, the number of hulls, and one question, which is the question the college wants its students to carry out of the room. This was in the building the whole time. Who was ever going to look at it? Ottiline Ferrant died at 79 in a coastal town, having outlived the inquiry that ended her career by 31 years and most of the people who had sat on it. She gave one interview in that time, late, to a service historian, and it ran to 5 hours and is mostly about supply. Toward the end, the historian asked the question everybody asks, which is whether she would do it again. The answer is not the one that gets quoted, because the one that gets quoted is short and sounds decisive. What she actually said took a while. You are asking whether I would strip the fortress again. Yes, obviously yes, I have said so for 30 years. But that is not the interesting question, and you know it is not. The interesting question is the 4 years before. I commanded that place for 4 years, and it took me until the 5th to open a salvage manifest, and there was nothing stopping me doing it in the first month, except that I was busy, and it was boring, and it was not my job anymore. Everything I am praised for is a consequence of a thing I did far too late. So no, I do not lie awake about the 461. I lie awake about year 2. Nobody ever asks about year 2. She was asked what she thought would have happened if she had opened the manifests in year 2. I would have been ignored, she said, for 4 years probably, because Sector Command would have had exactly the same reasons to ignore me, and I would have had exactly the same 51 days. But the 4 years would have been spent arguing instead of holding, and 11,000 of us would still be here. Then she said the thing the historian led with, and which is on the flyleaf of every printed edition of the reforms. Being right early is the entire job. Everything after that is damage control. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. A new one leaves Earth every day.